things. So the topic for this one is going to be about broadcast rights, because it's obviously something that's very topical at the moment, whether for good or for ill, and it's something that I feel like it's a logical thing that on the trajectory of esports getting bigger and becoming more of a mainstream industry will become more and more pertinent. But part of what I alluded to before, but the fact that some people worry whether it is a good thing, is that perhaps it hasn't been explained as a concept that well to people, and people they're not really sure what it means entirely. So Noah, can I ask you this first? Since you're someone who is owning a team and presumably knows something about like some of the concept of how sports deal with these sorts of things, right? I've seen some of the breakdowns when people talk about the difference in revenue streams in sports and esports. And one of the main ones they always talk about is that in esports, at the moment, it's nearly only, like if you did a big pie chart, it would be nearly all of the pie would be sponsorship, basically. And what they always tend to show you is that in sports, the sponsorship aspect is like way smaller. And then you have obviously like merchandising, so fans that set pay-per-view, but then broadcast rights tends to make up, it's usually a fairly large amount, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So in traditional sports, broadcast rights held at both the league level and the local level for teams are a really significant percentage of the revenue pie. And of course, there are massive differences in the way that broadcast rights work in traditional sports versus in esports. Of course, like linear versus digital broadcasting makes that model very, very different. But at least on a pretty basic basis, broadcast rights are an important way for sports and esports to monetize, because that content is the most significant product of any professional sports league, right? The games themselves are where most of the focus gets put. It's where the biggest viewership happens. And so it generates a lot of value for whatever platform that content happens to live on. And so from a traditional sports perspective, the channel that the Super Bowl is broadcast on, or from an esports perspective, the platform that a CSGO major is broadcast on, is determined frequently not just by where the audience is, but by licensing fees paid to the content creator, in this case, the people operating the leagues.
Okay. Right. Ulrich, ESL, to give people like a rough timeline, can you think roughly when do you think this actually became an issue for like ESL and people in esports, of like being able to sell broadcast rights, or not just hosting it on a particular streaming service, but actually getting like a deal in place and something, whether it was initially money or not in play? Do you know what like a rough timeline would be? How long ago do you think it started?
I think probably 3 to 4 years ago. I mean, if I look back really, really far into, say, 2005, 2006, there was a point when, there weren't really any streaming services and everything was hosted on, say, dedicated servers with like 2,000 slots maybe. So when I got started, we had just launched a channel in Germany, Giga 2, that was actually pay-per-view, so you could only watch it if you paid for it. And then slowly, I mean, the other things came, Octoshape, I don't know if people recall that.
Yes.
It was obviously basically used your bandwidth to create that streaming network. So everybody who watched was also at the same time uploading. And then, sometime we had owned and Justin and Twitch. And I think that's where, after that point, when it was really established, because before that it was really only about finding a platform that would even allow you live streaming. At that point, it wasn't, I mean, basically any platform that you can go to these days allows some form of live streaming, but back then it was basically Justin or Twitch. It wasn't really anything else that existed. So I would say 3 to 4 years ago was the point where then those platforms were really established, and it became interesting to other platforms that hadn't been interested so far. And at that point, it also became interesting to give those platforms exciting content that they can use to pull this. To pull the audience to their channels. So I would say, when Hitbox and Azubo came around, was probably the first time that the status quo of the existing platform, Twitch in that case, was challenged to some degree, right? I mean, there were League of Legends players that were on Azubo, but overall it was never as successful as people probably hoped it would be. But that was really the point where it became a competition, rather than just the tournament organizers going to the only relevant platform and putting their content there.
Okay. Right. Fwiz, obviously working with YouTube, people will know, for example, in CSGO a few years ago at ESL Pro League, got this deal where it was broadcasted there. Then ECS also was a similar time frame, I remember. What is the significance, if you are a streaming service, of broadcast rights? Like, what do they enable? What's the upside? What's in it for you guys?
Yeah, generally speaking, we've shied away from spending too much money in the licensing business for exclusivity. The draw that we had was that Counter-Strike is a thriving game on YouTube as far as size and scale. And so we thought it was a pretty interesting opportunity to see if we could license esports content in the Counter-Strike game, in Counter-Strike specifically, to see if we could accelerate the unique users within that category, right? Because obviously all the consumption that was happening in Counter-Strike on YouTube was all on the VOD side. It's not like we had Counter-Strike streamers. And so we thought, this would be a great way to go get into the category from a live standpoint. And we were really happy with it. I just think, at some point we need to be fiscally responsible in how we invest, and that other platforms might have unique benefit to doing licensing deals that we don't necessarily benefit from. If you look at Facebook, they've got a new product in live that they're really trying to market and get eyeballs on. And that reminds me of, when we first launched really live streaming in a material way in 2015. Twitch has a very unique model where they are a live native platform and live first, and they are trying to grow their unique user base. And obviously, they kind of groomed and started esports. The difficulty for us is, we're so big on how many unique users we have watching gaming content on YouTube that you've got to be able to justify doing licensing deals if they're going to add incremental users to the platform. And that's still kind of like, from a YouTube perspective, the case is still out on if you license this content, any content for that matter, and bring it over exclusively to YouTube, are you actually increasing the unique user base, or are you just displacing what they're watching? So like, the Counter-Strike users on our platform, obviously consuming a ton of VOD Counter-Strike content, and very specifically in the esports category, right? They're watching highlights, VODs, shoulder content, any of that ancillary human interest pieces. When you throw live streaming on there, if you're just displacing them going from watching human interest pieces to just watching the live stream, it is really hard to rationalize kind of the investment in licensing. So that's a thing that we've been spending time working on. And the other thing that, why there was such appeal to license was, could we bolster our sales package when we go out to market and be able to sell not only premium CPMs. So for those that don't know, like the advertising that goes against it, particularly not the sponsorships, but the pre-roll or the mid-roll, the advertisement that you see. Were you able to, like, having those leagues, does it create more value to go out and buy more advertising against the platform? So this was kind of what we were testing the waters with both those investments. It was very obvious and publicly obvious that we cornered the Counter-Strike market for this test. And so yeah, that's kind of long-winded what our thought process has been around the matter.
Okay, Ulrich, as a tournament organizer, obviously, this goes back to what I said before about the only model before, particularly for people like ESL, was to get sponsorship pretty much until, obviously you have the live audience now to some degree, if it's a big LAN tournament. What do you think is the significance of broadcast rights for you? Like, is this something that has become more and more a part of the business model of ESL? Obviously, we're not talking specifically only about the Facebook deal. As I said, we've referenced earlier, there was the YouTube one. More of as an abstract concept of where does it fit into the business model? And is this something where, like, does it have to be a big thing in the next 5-10 years for ESL to grow as a company? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think there's some kind of misconception also among the general audience about where the revenue streams typically sit. You said sponsorship, and that's one of the key pillars. But media rights is another one of the key pillars. And I wouldn't say it's less or more important, but it's one of those pillars that even makes those events possible. And if you look at how they evolved and how much money goes into creating them, but also how much money goes into, say, catering to teams, right? We're flying one more player to each event this year, for example, and we've done so last year. So there's an increase in cost every year. And sponsorship and media rights are really the two key pillars. And people think about, for example, ticketing revenue, which is a key thing in say if you have a boxing fight, then the gate is insane.
Yes.
I mean, typically a lot of money, but for esports, it's not no money, but at the moment it's not significant yet. The key is really rather getting people to the events than and they're not ready to spend a lot of money yet on this, and maybe they never will, right? It might be a change in habit, but for us, it's really, if media rights and sponsorship wouldn't exist at a sizable portion, then we wouldn't be able to put on those events. So it's actually not about maximizing profit or anything like that, but we need those to host the events. And as something that Ryan alluded to is generating the advertising. I think there's also the conception, even among some of the professional teams. We think that we as a tournament organizer, we put a stream on Twitch and then we get the regular, ad revenue share like anybody else. But that's not how these things typically work. Typically, there's a minimum guarantee for the bigger tournament organizers. Okay. So for anyone who's at a certain size, they will get a minimum guarantee from the platform, or maybe just flat out some, to get those rights to stream, and then the platform will monetize it. So it's not, there isn't a key interest in saying, I think at some point one of the EG managers in Dota said, disable your ad blockers and help them. Right. And disabling ad blockers is certainly something that should happen, but it's mostly for the platform, because the platform cannot monetize the content. If the platform cannot monetize the content, then they can't pay the tournament organizers. So it's really all related to each other. And I think to me it's a little frustrating when actually there isn't a lot of paid content in esports, that there's still even a resistance to watching a pre-roll or to watching a mid-roll, which is really the only thing that makes this work. Because Twitch has obviously some other revenue sources of subscriptions, but really without watching some kind of commercials, there's no way these tournaments happen, and there's no way any of the players can do what they currently do.
Yeah, it's a big on that point too, because it's so. If the platforms struggle to justify the licensing deals, like it's very appropriate for the ESLs and Facets of the world who are independent tournament organizers, and by that I mean they're not affiliated with a gaming publisher. If they need to be able to put on these productions that are sizable and very costly investments. So when they go and ask the platforms for a minimum guarantee, it is very justifiable of an ask. The problem then becomes, are the platforms able to sustain the ask that's coming out of the leagues? And that's tough when there is no path to recouping on the investment. And what you see notoriously is that heavy PC users are esports consumers, and they are heavy ad blocking users, yes. Right? And so you get to a point where thankfully Twitch has Twitch Prime and can think about other ways to justify their investment in esports. But everybody across the board, all platforms are, and by that I mean all video platforms, see that like, wow, it's really, really tough to monetize esports. There are sponsors that are coming in and they are making sizable investments. You can look at like Overwatch League, had some big ones. You can look at E-League when they got Buffalo Wild Wings. You can look at what Riot's starting to do with State Farm. And sponsorships are different, but it has become increasingly difficult to justify because of how little ad impressions are being served because of ad block rates being so high. And I think it's a scary state for esports because esports, it's growing, but it's not like explosive growth. I mean, we talk about esports being like the next major sport, but nothing from a data perspective suggests that. And actually the esports growth has been underwhelming, all things considered, with how much we're talking about it. So it's not like the growth rate is going to be so big that you can be like, hey, ad blocking, it's okay. People don't need to watch ads. The growth is so explosive. All these other people are going to make up for it. That's not really the case. So I do worry about the economics of esports licensing in general. Now, I don't want to say that too much as a blanket statement because there are nuances to that where it's not applicable to everything. But there is concern on some of the viewer behavior and lack of understanding the monetization aspect and actually how they could potentially be hindering it when they are ad blocking. It's just hard to justify sometimes these investments because of it.
Okay.
So I actually want to chime in there and draw a little bit of context, if that's okay, Duncan.
Okay. Yes, do it. Come on.
I think from my perspective, when we talk about broadcast rights in esports and we talk about broadcast rights in traditional sports, it's really easy to forget about the fundamental difference between the two. In traditional sports, sure, there are ads, but if I'm watching NBC, I'm paying a subscription fee to watch NBC on my television. There's a direct-to-consumer monetization model from day zero of being a cable subscriber that you just don't have in esports, right? If I'm watching Twitch or YouTube or Facebook, chances are it's free unless it's a YouTube Red product. That means that the broadcast rights become solely dependent on CPM-based advertising, right? The ads that you have to watch in the middle of the content you want or before you get to access the content you want. And I personally hate that model. I don't believe that that model is inherently necessary to make content work. And I don't believe that that model is inherently necessary to fund well-produced tournaments or to fund higher player salaries or to fund a growing scene. The real problem as I see it, and I would love to get, everyone else's thoughts on this because you approach this from a very different perspective than I do. But if you look at an individual streamer, let's say, like Ninja, the ad revenue on Ninja's content is relatively insignificant compared to his subscription revenue, merchandising revenue, donation revenue, all the ways that his fans are supporting him directly versus the business to business
on Twitch. You mean on Twitch? Yeah, because his ad revenue on YouTube is massive, and so when you look at his cumulative revenue, advertising is a big part of it.
Fair enough. And look, I would never say that it's, de minimis, right? Of course, I expect that to be a sizable chunk. But I think if Ninja had to choose giving up all of his ad revenue or giving up all of his subscriber revenue would win out on that one. Without even taking into account all the other ways that he can monetize his fans directly rather than selling those eyeballs to a third-party brand and the brand hoping that they can monetize them. So from my perspective, when I look at esports tournaments and esports event broadcasts, the issue is less an ad block usage rate, and the issue is more a functionality problem, right? There's a reason that ESL doesn't get a ton of revenue from subscribers on Twitch when they were broadcasting on Twitch, right? There's a reason that Immortals or LA Valiant as a team doesn't generate a ton of subscriber or donation revenue. And I think a lot of that is due to the functionality with which these platforms were built, right? Twitch, YouTube, these were built for individual content creators. Yes. And that's still where the vast majority of their content comes from. So it makes sense that they optimize for that. But knowing that, we have to acknowledge that these platforms and their current functionalities are not optimized for teams and they're not optimized for tournament organizers, which is why broadcast rights in esports have had some difficulty when it comes to teams and tournament organizers because the platforms are not really set up to take advantage of them. I mean, if you want to look at Facebook has a massive audience. It has a really big platform, but from a functionality perspective, they're still building out all of the pieces they need to make it a successful endeavor for the creators that are a part of that platform. So when I look at something like Twitch's project with Overwatch League, I see a way out of that. I don't think it's perfect yet. I think there's a lot more work to do, but what Twitch and Overwatch League are doing together is so much more than just put the content on our platform and let us sell ads against it. It's creating new tools of monetization that allow you to take a fan and have them do more than just sit captive for 30 seconds to watch an ad from one of your brand partners.
Okay. What is the gist of what they do by the way?
No, I think everything he just said is incredibly fair points. The thing about esports tournaments in particular, the watch time, when you look at where the business is, it obviously is still variety streamers and YouTube creators and so forth, because the esports licensing business as a whole, like when you look at esports tournaments rather as a whole, is only, let's say like 2 billion hours of watch time. It's still hard to justify over indexing on too much product and innovation on that side because your bread and butter is on the creator side. Having said that, I think everything Noah just said is like spot on. You can't justify the esports licensing business, period. You cannot justify it through sales and sponsorships on the platform side. It's not, no platform can justify it. When they're going out and doing deals, they're not doing it because they have figured out a way to justify it from a monetization standpoint. I've looked at this at different companies and I've cut it a million different ways, and it's impossible to justify. And I do think there is something impressive about the Twitch Prime business and what they're able to do with the subscription side on Overwatch League. But I still think that's to be determined, because there is still a user behavior that is not inclined to want to spend and invest on that like they are going to do with a creator. So it'd be interesting to see if that kind of gets proven out with the Overwatch League or not, which is an expensive proposition. So the amount of alternative monetization outside of advertising that you have to create is pretty significant to kind of cover the cost of investment.
Okay.
What I want to chime in there with, if it's okay, Duncan, is kind of a hybrid statement and question, right? And which is, number one, in a lot of the conversations I've had with the people that work on the platform side, whether it's Twitch, YouTube, Facebook, or more of the traditional platforms, they've drawn the analogy between esports tournament content and the way that, say, the NFL is treated by linear broadcast or traditional cable broadcast in American media, right? Which is, it's not going to make you a ton of money. It's not going to be super profitable, but it is like a tentpole piece of content that has a trickle-down effect to all the other content that is cheaper for the platform to have, i.e., Twitch wants Overwatch League on Twitch because that will make all the other Overwatch streamers on Twitch get more viewership, right? Okay. Or YouTube wants Counter-Strike on YouTube because those Counter-Strike tournaments will cause trickle-down effects to the individual content creators in the Counter-Strike community on YouTube. So knowing that, and also knowing that paying out massive license fees as kind of a marketing strategy is not a super sustainable model, surely from the platform perspective, shouldn't there be an effort, rather than just investing in core dollars to attract content, shouldn't there be an effort to invest dollars in product development to create a compelling thesis for why a fan should be able to directly be monetized by the tournament organizer? Because I 100% agree, right? Like, being a Twitch sub of a random Counter-Strike tournament is not really getting you much. But maybe that's not an issue with Counter-Strike tournaments. Maybe that's an issue with Twitch subs being the primary method of monetization on Twitch. And I don't want to make that seem like it's just Twitch, right? Like, this is the same on YouTube, right? If I am a tournament organizer putting my tournament content on YouTube, how do I make money off of the people watching beyond ad and sponsor sales? And how does the product functionality allow me to better reach and monetize my audience? And I feel like in the rush to just like make headlines about the newest piece of content that a platform acquires, and as license fees have gotten higher and higher, really just based on forecasts about ad sales, the kind of core ideation around product functionality seems to have fallen a little bit by the wayside, which I've been very disappointed in, because I think in the long term, that's what drives value, right? In the short term, of course, I want tournament organizers to have the highest license fees possible, because that eventually trickles down to the teams and the players too. But in the long term, if we don't figure out how to better monetize our audience through functionality improvements and through product improvements, then we're all going to be in trouble, because the audience is big, but we don't do enough with them.
I agree with all of that. I think the hard part sometimes, I like literally agree with every single word you just said. I think the hard part about it is esports it's a little bit of a chicken and egg issue, because esports isn't at a size where you would say, I'm going to stop working on these products that serve the masses to prioritize them at a higher, to understand how to better monetize esports tournaments in specific. And I think sometimes that can be a dilemma as well. As you see esports become bigger and bigger, and it no doubt will become bigger and bigger. I think you'll start seeing it, because it is very much proven out that you can't justify it off of this halo effect that you were talking about and the trickle down effect, and you can't justify it off of ads and sponsorships alone. And so there will continue to be appetite in the business to have the rights to this content across all of these platforms. And they, very naturally will have to figure out other ways to monetize it outside of this business. I agree with all of that. It's just, when will esports become big enough where we're drawing, on a Tuesday night, 1 million concurrent just for some regular season programming, where all of this is like, okay, we should put the product and end resources in here to monetize it. We should be writing these big checks, and we can justify both the product eng investment as well as the content investment. I just don't think it's there yet, but it's making great progress.
See, my thesis here is that and this is a pure thesis, right? Like, I could very easily be proven wrong, But my thesis here is that I don't know that the size of the audience is the real issue here, right? I think if we look at core esports fans and we look at their gaming habits, they monetize at such a higher rate along every other metric compared to a random casual gamer watching.
Yeah, they do.
Right? And when they are given opportunities to get real value in exchange for their money, you see them pay money hand over fist. I mean, look at the way that TI crowdfunds their prize pool, and it gets faster and faster and bigger every single year. Look at the hardware businesses that are built around the kind of serious competitive gamer before trickling down to the casual gamer, like Razer or Logitech. Look at the platforms like Faceit and ESEA that have been built on competitive gamers and esports fans and are generating millions of dollars.
Yeah, I agree with all that. By what I meant is I do think there is an audience that exists today that a platform could tap into and start rationalizing all of this. I think from the perspective of YouTube, the business isn't big enough to say we're going to take people off of X, Y, and Z over here and move them to start creating it. I do think the audience that's there today that you could do something with them. It's tough for us to kind of rationalize it given the other things that need worked on. But I agree, hardcore gamers are big spenders, and it's a big opportunity to figure out kind of other ways to monetize the business. And I do think and look, Twitch is already starting work on that today. I do think there's other avenues.
Is this an issue where as some of the things that you guys have outlined is basically some of the limitations of doing this? Like, even if you get a big deal, like, what can you actually deliver to the person? Is it worth it financially for them right now to do the deal? It sounds like it isn't to some degree, they're doing it for marketing or to get their foot in the door. Or, for example, like you're saying here, Ryan, basically it's in the UK, you call it a loss leader, where a supermarket sells the bottle of Coke for $1, which is less than it should be. But so you go into their supermarket, you buy all the rest of your gear. So this all sounds a little bit like there's some limiting factors at the moment where it can't at the moment go much bigger. Do broadcast rights have to grow bigger and bigger and bigger in the next few years to a big degree for things like ESL to be able to do a tournament that's 10 times the prize money and bigger outreach, for things like the Overwatch League to succeed? Are these things in some way contingent on this getting figured out, or can it just grow at its own very gradual rate? What would you say?
I think it's interesting because it's there are two models that you basically described. One is a tournament organizer just running a tournament and monetizing that tournament, and then the other one is a publisher running a tournament, but at the same time monetizing, at the back of it, the game, which is essentially the entire Riot business model, right? Anything they've ever done. They've made an amazing deal with ML BAM about broadcast rights, but on the sponsorship side, on everything else, what they monetize is the game. So it's essentially marketing expenditure for them. They don't need to break even. They have amazing tournaments, but there's no need to break even on that specific product, which is different for a tournament organizer, obviously, because we don't participate in any of the revenue of the game. So what Valve does, for example, is put on, the international, but at the same time monetize the game, right? And you could even argue to what degree is the Battle Pass an esports element and not just an element of the game, which is then focused towards funding a prize pool.
Yes.
But could essentially also be, essentially you could run a Battle Pass throughout the entire year and maybe just take 25% of all game revenue and put it in an esports fund and might have the same results. That's hard to say, but I think that's the key difference and why it's interesting for some of the publishers to run it on their own is because they have this different revenue stream. And that's really a core engagement place also for the audience, because they engage with the game and they're willing to spend money on the game because at some other point they might already have done it. Whereas for tournament organizers, it's a little different. And I think especially what we hinted is that, the loss leader or the lighthouse effect. That's probably what esports tournaments are at this point, is that they are something that can draw people to a certain platform. That's obviously a reason why Facebook is doing it at the moment. It's to get people onto their platform. So really for us as a tournament organizer, that is an area where we have to invest in, whereas for a publisher, it's inherently probably better to not monetize a league they run through media rights, through potentially restricting the audience, but rather running it non-exclusively, getting as many eyeballs on it as possible, and then taking these people into the game and monetizing them there where they have direct access to them.
Okay. I also feel like, again, maybe, I don't know who would touch on this, but there's also clearly a difference between ESL getting a broadcast deal and the game developer doing it. Because here, one of the problems that I've already seen start to occur with all deals basically that weren't Twitch is that because so many people are habituated to going to Twitch to find the tournament, not going through some other site, that you don't get all the audience necessarily when you get that deal as well. It's not like you're all bidding for the same amount of eyeballs. Like, there might be more if it was on Twitch, but you might get less for the deal. And so the part of the problem is, how do you get that audience over to this other platform? Now, if it was the game developer, they could get a workaround, as in they could put it inside the game client, and you click on it when you open it, or you're already there, you're a captive audience. But we've already seen with some of these other platforms, sometimes people just aren't aware of it, or it's difficult to get them over there, or then there's obviously user-based idiosyncrasies of do they like the platform, all these other factors that obviously wouldn't be as much of an issue in the sports broadcast model because it's the same television, the channel's not going to be that different, unfortunately it's more of an even playing ground in that sense, right?
I agree. All of that's true. I would caveat the one thing that when we looked at licensing esports that we were most excited about was not the transferring of audience. On a personal level, I was hoping, because we have, hundreds of millions of people that are watching gaming, I was hoping that we were going to introduce more gaming users that would be interested in esports. I think it's still to be determined. Like, I definitely have, you can't conclusively say that it has not or it has, but it was less about transferring the audience and more about, hey, here's this thing that you may have never realized that was happening on another platform where people are playing video games competitively. Like, what's your thoughts on this? And are you interested in it? Now, fair enough, we've had to work on a lot of ways to make sure that's prominently being surfaced to those users and how do they come across it. But I thought that was the real opportunity from a personal standpoint on the YouTube end. And I think we're still really interested in pursuing that.
I think from my side, the way that I see it is similar to what you're mentioning here, that I'm not convinced that there's necessarily a massive amount of audience transference, which is why generally when we talk about broadcast rights, platforms that don't already have a built-in audience that is interested in gaming are tough platforms on which gaming content could live. Because while there is some audience transference, you also need an audience that's already on that platform to kind of take up the cause themselves. I think from my side, if I could offer a little bit of a broader diagnosis and then have holes poked in it by the people that understand their pieces of that business ecosystem more than I do. The way that I see it is up until this point in esports, for tournament organizers like ESL and for teams, because they don't have the fundamental financial engine of the game that publishers do, they've been required to kind of optimize for a very ad and sponsor driven business model, which is a business model that significantly prioritizes overall audience and overall reach rather than prioritizing kind of direct to consumer monetization, right? In order to sell a sponsorship, like, they don't really care if you have 1,000 people that each bought $1,000 of merch over the last month. They care if you can reach 10 million people, which ESL in its current incarnation can, which is how ESL goes out and secures the sponsors and the licensing dollars that allow it to run its tournament business. In that model, though, what ends up happening is that in order to appeal to as wide a range of people as possible, you end up really focusing on the base of the pyramid of fans rather than the top of the pyramid of fans, which is why for most esports broadcasters or esports teams, you don't really have an ability to monetize a fan beyond, charging them $25 for a t-shirt, charging them $40 for a ticket, or charging them $5 for a Twitch subscription. And I think this is a massive problem because it leads to this kind of like watering down of content to appeal to as many people as possible, rather than a specialization of content or kind of embracing our role as a little bit more of a vertical niche, right? I don't think esports needs to be this massive universal thing that anyone from ages 10 to 50 can enjoy. And I'm certainly not taking up the banner of trying to convert 55-year-old baseball fans into esports fans. I don't think we need that. I think what we need is we need to do a better job of serving the fans that we already have so that they feel more inclined to deliver value back to the teams and the platforms and the events of the content that they consume. Exactly what was just said about the YouTube side, right? Like, I 100% agree that there is a core and a cool gaming audience on YouTube that could probably be exposed to esports through the licensing of esports content. The problem is that esports content probably shouldn't look identical to what it looks like on Twitch, and it probably shouldn't look identical to what it looks like on Facebook. And there should probably be additional product functionality that is specifically catered to a YouTube audience that is different from a Twitch audience, and that is different from a Facebook audience, and that is different from a Twitter audience. The problem is, though, that because nobody is doing that, we keep kind of butting our heads up against this assumption that the issue with esports is that our audience isn't big enough, and I fundamentally disagree with that. I think if we're going to stick with this model, where we're caring mostly about CPMs and Twitter followers, you're right, the esports model isn't big enough. We don't have a big enough audience. But I think that there are so many ways that we have the ability to fix that and to do a better job for the audience we already have and build a sustainable business out of that, rather than kind of like exclaiming, woe is me, I guess we need to go get more moms to watch esports.
Yeah. One thing I will just say to tag on to that quickly is that would immediately help with some of the issue when you do have to transfer audience. Because again, I can understand if you're the user sat at home and you hear, okay, a company that I don't really care about did a big deal and they get a lot of money. So the same stream that I was going to watch anyways on a different platform. And if I don't happen to like that platform, understandably, that guy in his own selfish world is going to be like, fuck this is bullshit. Whereas if there was a whole thing where, I don't know, it's as a better casting setup or as a pre-show that is entirely, it's emphasized that this is entirely because of the new service, whatever. If there was something where it felt like you were getting something additional, I feel like even that would in some way sort of like battle against that resistance that you were referring to earlier. Because that's part of the problem. It's the same thing. It's on a different platform.
And the other thing I would just tag on to that with is the people that do transfer over are your most engaged and most hardcore fans. And so you'd hope that on the platform waiting for them, if you are asking them to switch platforms, there's something that adds to their experience for being so loyal to the content creator that they're willing to go to an entirely different platform to consume that content. But as it exists right now, because we're more kind of audience focused rather than engaged fan focused, it's really hard to justify building that functionality because, as Rand said, the overall numbers aren't there. But my assertion here is maybe focusing on how to monetize the top 1% of fans at $1,000 a year each is going to lead to better results than focusing on how to get the bottom 90% of fans to monetize at $1 per year each.
Yeah, that's all good, but that's all good about making the economics work today, but you still need to be like, okay, how are we going to grow that user base to make esports sizable enough? And then you're going to have that same challenge as you go down the funnel with people. So I think half of what you're saying is accurate as far as there's an opportunity to better monetize it through different products today. And I don't think anybody in their right mind would disagree with that, but you still have to be able to see this audience get materially bigger for it to justify the investment, period. It's cool to you can justify the economics today, and I think that's a very fair point. But you've got to still figure out how you can get this thing into a much bigger size, and you're not going to be able to monetize the rest of that funnel the way that you do that 1% of the hardcore users. And how they're going to monetize, they're not going to be chipping in $1,000. They might be passive viewers of esports. They might come around just for the championship. And they're still going to need you're going to need to be able to do something with them. And right now, and probably for the foreseeable future, the only thing you can do with those people that are passive gamers or casual gamers that are interested in these big moments are to monetize them from an ads perspective, because they're not going to come in and pay $100 a year or pay $9.99 a month for a digital exclusive skin. Yeah, there are many gamers that will, but there are many that won't. And I still think if you build the model around just monetizing the hardcore users, you will struggle to scale in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, and I mean, I think the dilemma we're stuck in is that I agree we're not big enough yet. I think that's also my assessment. We need to grow the audience, because if we wanted to monetize the current audience, and I think it sounds really bad, but monetize in a way that can we finance what's currently happening in esports, the kind of tournaments that are happening, the kind of teams that exist from the existing user base, with a different model that doesn't say rely on sponsorship, doesn't rely on media rights, it would have to increase so much in spend per user that I don't think we can get there really fast. And overall, I mean, most of the big sports, they are at a point, and not sure if that's great for the consumer. There are certainly downsides to that, but they have an audience. So to them, it's about maximizing broadcast revenue. So they essentially, I mean, in Germany, for example, Sky used to be the holder of Bundesliga rights for a long time, and now DAZN came in, and they have some of the Champions League rights, for example. But soccer is at a point where they basically don't need to care about growing the audience anymore. They're just looking at where can they maximize the revenue, because that's what the teams care about. Don't think that's great for the user base, especially if they're used to being on a certain channel. Now there's 2 channels, and there's 3 and 4, and similar to what's now happening to Netflix, where it used to be one platform for content, and now it's Amazon Prime and Hulu and all these other platforms that are being launched. So that's not necessarily great for the consumer, but I personally think that we aren't at a point yet where we could say, okay, this is the existing audience. We can monetize the whales in the way that say mobile games do it, and finance everything with that. But I think there's still a need to grow the base, just because there's also the issue, obviously, of people, shifting from game to game. So you can't rely on an audience that's here today to be there tomorrow. If, for example, they move from Counter-Strike to PUBG or to Fortnite, then you've lost them, at least for that specific game, and you don't necessarily recover them easily through some other way. So you need a bigger base, which at the moment is pretty fragile. If only a small percentage of the audience leaves, that already puts into question some of the existing tournaments that are run at this point.
All right, Fwiz, I know you need to go. So do you want to make a final point on your behalf?
No, actually, look, I think these are great conversations. We should be, thanks for just, organizing it to get it together. I think the licensing complexity is a very real one that both the teams, the organizers, and platforms, which is a great obvious forum that you have here, needs to get together, because I do think there are things that we should be thinking of that we're not thinking of that we could be doing. So I'd love to, even though like ESL's on Facebook and, you guys are doing a lot with the Overwatch League that's on Twitch, that doesn't mean that all of us can't be coming together more often. And personally, I want to make more of my time into having these kind of conversations to see what we can do. Super passionate, obviously my background's in the space, and I think we owe it to the esports industry to make sure that we're contributing on how we can push it forward. So thanks a ton for having me on, and looking forward to kind of keeping the conversation going.
So, okay, Fwiz had to leave us because that's just the life he lives, or the way he organizes things. Either way, it's irrelevant. I've got to deal with the situation of what is at hand. So, okay, I've got a question for you in this sense, Noah. So within this group, it might not be as obvious to people on the outside why it matters to teams as much that there's broadcast rights, because they might think to themselves, okay, I can understand why the platform wants to use broadcasting rights, because YouTube wants to potentially get an audience that's watching on Twitch a specific league for whatever reasons we brought up now, and perhaps in the future it will become actually directly more financially viable. People might understand quite obviously why ESL and Ulrich would want to have broadcasting rights paid to them to show the tournament, because it's more money in their pocket potentially. It's perhaps even in some scenarios might even mean one day being on a better platform even. Who knows? In terms of a team, lay it out for us. Why is it beneficial for the team, if not directly now, in the future, or right now? I mean, presumably for people who don't know, I mean, a lot of this focused around Counter-Strike, because that's where a lot of the high-profile deals have been, but obviously some are working in the past League of Legends, now in Overwatch. There's leagues that share some of this revenue potentially with teams, right? So how does it work out in terms of the team aspect?
Yeah, so I think there are a few different layers. First is the way that the leagues interact with platforms and the way that trickles down to the teams. So many leagues that we participate in have revenue sharing models where if they generate more revenue overall, i.e. from getting a bigger licensing fee from a platform, that has a direct financial contribution to us. I also think that Of course, at a secondary level, if there's a big and engaged audience watching a league or a tournament that we participate in, that makes our sponsorship rights more valuable, and it means that we can go out there and sell our sponsorships for more money if ESL tournaments that we compete in are getting many more viewers than they did last year. But then there's also the third level to consider, which is teams can sometimes act in a very similar way that tournament organizers do and kind of commit themselves and their players to certain platforms. And thinking about it from that perspective, I think there's also a whole nother conversation we can have, and in the remaining time we have now, I don't know if now's the right time, about the functionality suite and the product necessities of a platform that's catered to providing a really good experience for fans of a certain team who might be general Counter-Strike fans, they might be ESL Counter-Strike fans, they might specifically be the fans of a certain Counter-Strike player. But if they're very motivated by their fandom of a particular team, I'm really interested for a future in which platforms are able to deliver different functionality and different tools of engagement for fans that are kind of engaging along that axis, rather than just saying, I like Counter-Strike, so I'm going to watch as much general Counter-Strike content as possible.
Okay. At this point in time, when you sell a big investor on coming into Immortals or LA Valiant, whoever it might be, is this actually an aspect that gets brought up at all? I mean, I know in the past I heard a number of stories about, big investor type people coming to esports, and then one of the things that put them off was seeing like, oh, there's not really much of a revenue model here, and actually, the fans don't really sort of contribute as much, and it's just simple sponsorships and things. Is this much of an issue at this point in time?
Yeah, so look, I think we're obviously in the infancy of the revenue model of esports, right? I think part of that is because from a cost perspective, esports has scaled really quickly. If you look at an ESL event today compared to an ESL event from like 10 years ago, that's a very different event. If you look at the salaries that we pay our players and the way we treat our players and the investment we put into them and the content that we create as an organization, that looks a lot different than what organizations were doing 10 years ago. And so I think there was certainly a time where esports was very sustainable at a kind of lower production quality level and a lower audience level off of just the peripheral sponsorships and the PC sponsorships and streaming on Twitch and not going out there for looking for new licensing deals. And it was sustainable, right? But I don't think anybody was really content at that level, right? Everyone wanted to find a way for it to grow, to deliver more value to their audience, to grow bigger as an organization or as an organizer or as a tournament platform or a content platform. And so I think through that scaling, though we've identified ways to add more value to our audience and to create more cool content, I think where we've lagged behind a little as an industry is in finding more ways to very specifically target fans and find the things that will add the most value to their experience and then monetize it in return, right? And so as I think about our future as an organization, and I hope the future of platforms and tournament organizers and other organizations going into the future years of esports, I hope what we'll be thinking about is, yes, sponsorships are great, content licensing is great, ads are a necessary source of revenue in our current model. But 5 years from now, I want to live in a world where we're able to monetize much more with merchandising, where we're able to monetize much more with building a community and building subscription products on top of it that deliver value to our fans, and then our fans deliver value back to us. And that doesn't just need to happen on a team basis, that needs to happen across every level of the industry. And I actually think that that's exactly what publishers do and why publisher-run leagues are successful, even if they don't generate sponsorship or ad dollar revenue, right? Because for Riot Games with LCS, their thesis there is that they are going to make so much more money from the selling of skins inside the game and from the increased engagement of their audience inside the game compared to what a sponsorship would bring in for the league. And the problem is that ESL and teams and YouTube don't have an equivalent of the game, right? That's a pillar that a publisher has that nobody else has. And we all need to figure out, what is our scalable model? What is the thing that we are going to push our fans towards and that we are going to use to deliver value to them beyond the kind of generic value of the content itself? And the answer to that might be producing even higher quality content, but having it live behind a paywall and being comfortable with a smaller audience. The answer might be holding smaller events that might not be in 10,000 seat arenas, but they have higher ticketing prices and they have a cooler VIP experience and they have better food and beverage and it's an overall better experience for fans that attend in person. The answer might be trying to create, models or like kind of separate businesses that live next to the content itself, that you get to use the content and the audience that watches the content to acquire scale for right away. I look at what Fnatic does with Fnatic gear, and I see a team that is thinking about how do we monetize the people that are diehard fans of Fnatic in a different way than just selling them to a sponsor or to an advertiser. So I don't know what the true answer is here, right? And I don't think there's just one answer, but I am very convinced that the answer is not do what we're doing now and hope it eventually scales enough to work out.
Okay. Yeah, and I think at the core of what you said, there's something very interesting about how esports is different from other sports, and that is that there's been so much competition among different tournament organizers, also among teams, and also to some degree among publishers, mostly say among tournament organizers and teams. So there hasn't been, say, union of a league and the teams in it, and they've slowly built something, and they've built it in a scalable way where they looked at the revenue and they built then the product according to the revenue, but rather it's been a very aggressive market where every one of the tournament organizers tried to outbid the other one, where teams are trying to outbid each other, trying to secure the best players with really no restrictions in place, and the salary is always getting higher and the buyout sums always getting higher. So that has led to really fast growth. Obviously, it's great for the consumer because it's a lot of quality and the players can live good lives. But at the same time, it's also put the cost at a level where the monetization needs to be really aggressive, where there isn't an opportunity to wait or to take things slower or to go to a platform that might be better in its functionality but doesn't offer as much revenue. So that really has put everyone in the market with their backs to the walls, where they say we need to make this viable now because it's become so big and so costly because of all the competition. And we need to make it happen now. And the other thing that's also happened because of that process is that, for you as a team, obviously different in the Overwatch League than it is, say, on the free market. But if you're a CSGO team, then unless you have a really, really great brand, you're not very unique. There's a lot of CSGO teams in the market. And so it's more a buyer's market than it is a seller's market. And the same for tournament organizers. If I'm a platform, I want to buy CSGO content, there's a lot of places where I can get it. Not a lot of places where I can get the highest quality content. But to someone who just wants the content and doesn't really care about, say, nuances in viewership yet, just wants to put a flag in the ground, it's really easy to leverage tournament organizers against each other rather than the other way around, which was what most traditional sports leagues are, right? They have the NFL is the NFL. There isn't anything else that is comparable in the market. But if they put out, requests for bids, then they're the only ones, and everybody bids for their content. In esports is the other way around, and that's why I think, it's important for people to understand that that's why monetization is sometimes seems so aggressive or so fast, is because there isn't really an opportunity to wait because there's so much competition and so much drive to be the one who is relevant and be the one who's there in 10 years still, both on the team side as well as on the organizer side, that if things need to move so fast, otherwise you wouldn't be able to exist again next year as a tournament organizer, for example.
No,
and I think
in a sense, you guys are driving us into this position, right?
How are we driving you into that position?
He's just said all the costs are going up, mate. As the salaries go up and the buyouts go out and the whole industry gets inflated. It's all Immortals after all. And every industry I'm finding, Noah, it's you. You're the one blowing everything up, mate.
Always my fault. I'm used to that. So look, I was actually going to answer a very similar implied question, right? Which is, okay. Absolutely right? Like esports is in a much earlier stage of its life cycle than the NFL is today. And if you look at the history of the major sports leagues, when the MLB wasn't the MLB, but there were 2 or 3 different competing baseball leagues, and there were 2 or 3 different competing football leagues, and there were 2 or 3 different competing hockey leagues, then yes, it was certainly a much more competitive ecosystem, and certainly not as sticky with the fan base that would be a part of that ecosystem. But I also think that that's not necessarily the most fair overall assertion, because I think when you look at the investment pouring into the space, there's a good and a bad way to spend investor dollars, right? And a bad way to spend investor dollars is to tell investors, well, we're going to raise all of this money and then we're just going to go out and buy the best players, and that will mean we have all of the fans and we can sell sponsorships for more than any other team can. And that will mean that we've become profitable. And that's not really a business model, right? That's not actually scalable, and that's usually not how it happens, right? Just because you have an extra $5 million doesn't mean that you're automatically going to be able to go out and get the best players and have the best team and have the most fans.
Sure.
And so I think absolutely investor dollars into the space are important, but they need to be spent in a way that is starting to build revenue generating infrastructure, right? Whether it's ESL that's getting additional funding, or Immortals that's getting additional funding, or YouTube that's getting additional funding, those funds need to get put into something that then leads to long-term growth of the industry. And just shuffling around players or moving content from Twitch to YouTube to Facebook, those don't inherently grow esports. Those can be necessary steps in the growth of esports, but resources need to get invested into the technology infrastructure, into the fan experience, into all the other pieces that esports hasn't really had the time or the financial resources to develop yet in its life cycle. And if it is, then I'm bullish on the future of esports, because I think that those are the pieces that are missing and that stand between us and a better monetized and engaged space. But if those pieces don't get built, and if the investor dollars just get put into ever higher player salaries and nicer team houses and higher broadcast quality in an attempt to be competitive with the other people that hold a piece of the pie rather than grow the overall pie, that's where we get into trouble. Because this isn't a zero-sum game, but plenty of people treat it like it is. And that's what I worry about.
So one thing that I thought was a topic worth addressing, because it's something that I alluded to earlier as a concern of mine, is that when you discuss as an abstract concept broadcast rights, it becomes very, very different in practice in esports specifically, precisely because, like I said, it's not like an even playing ground. It's not like just switching TV channels to, I've heard NFL's on NBC this season, right, I'll just go over to that channel, which I also have, and it's somewhat similar broadcast, and I'm just essentially diverting my eyeballs there. As people have already seen with every single one of the deals that basically didn't involve it being broadcast on Twitch, you have these issues of getting people over to the other platform, and then there's going to be perhaps less viewers, and then you get into the position, Ulrich, which people always want to know, which is how do you weigh that up? Is the money up front worth it more than having the overall numbers? If the overall numbers mean that it's perceived that interest in the league shrinks, or it's a tough spot, right? It's not just literally figuring out who's going to pay me the most for the league.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's there's some things that are important to say. One is we had, for example, broadcast deals with Hitbox and Azubo in the past, and those could never have been exclusive because they are new platforms. So until they've built an audience, it will take a while. So it's too much of a risk to go exclusively to a platform that's unproven, doesn't really have a scalable user base yet. So I think from our side, when we made the first move to streaming English somewhere that isn't Twitch, it was YouTube. Back then, getting into the live streaming space, not totally established, but obviously the biggest video platform in the world. So there was an audience that already existed. The platform was, technically in some ways, superior to Twitch with free rewind and skipping in a running broadcast, for example. So that to us was where we said, the benefits we'll have from being able to use the revenue from that deal to make the product better and to keep it running, that will be, will far outweigh if there's a drop in viewership. And initially, there's always a drop in viewership. I know that for the current Facebook deal, there was an interview which said 10 to 15%. I think that's the long-term idea. And for YouTube, we've actually seen the YouTube numbers surpass what we had on Twitch in 2016, for example, for the second season. So after a while, the numbers were there. And I think for Facebook, the evaluation was similar, obviously with a key difference being that it wasn't established as a live streaming long form content platform yet. Obviously lots of small videos and clips, and 2 billion users. So that's a big audience to draw from, and also penetration markets that Twitch, for example, isn't present in, like Southeast Asia. They're very present in the Philippines, for example, much more than Twitch is. So that type of assessment is then made. Obviously, with Facebook, and I'm not going to deny that there are some technical challenges at the moment where the platform technically, and how easy it is to find streams, how easy it is to just use it as a streaming platform, that still isn't where it should be. But to us, that was something where we saw the opportunity for it long term to move people over and to grow the existing audience base. Now, obviously, that's something that will always be re-evaluated, so it's not going to be set in stone forever. But really, as long as a platform, and Mixer is one that's coming up as well, for example, very high market penetration because of the integration into the Xbox, for example, and all of the Windows pieces at some point. So as long as the platform is really big and has a big market penetration, it's potentially something that we can use. And I know it's a little tough to hear because the existing audience it doesn't really have a relationship to us where there's a subscription or anything like that.
Yes,
it's really, really tough to make a decision based on the existing audience where it doesn't create some level of I would say noise by having to move platforms. Because essentially, if we just can't run those tournaments in a financially viable way on the existing platforms because the deal is not in place or because some other things don't work, then there's really no other alternative. And we obviously want to grow the audience. Like I said, there's with the content being on Facebook now for some of our events, it still needs to grow. So if the numbers are going down, then that's not great, and we need it to be the other way around. We obviously don't want it to be an experience that people find bad. So that, it might happen that that's the case, and it's obviously something that we really want to work towards. But really, at the core of it is it a big, freely accessible platform that's stable and will give people a similar experience to what they're used to? Then we can go there. If that's not the case, then we also wouldn't consider it.
Noah, if I was to loop in a lot of what's been said to some of the things earlier about the economics not necessarily adding up to be someone who comes in and does a big spend, just in terms of it then making you profit directly from the eyeballs you get from having the exclusive rights, what would you say if someone said, because, okay, I would, as an outsider, say, to fans who say, I want it on Twitch, I would say, yeah, cool. Let's have Twitch be also someone who's in there bidding. And if they get it, then you know what? You get your Twitch experience and they pay some more to the orgs and the game devs. And then that all trickles down and hopefully we all just share more money. What if someone said, but doesn't that affect Twitch, for example, even as well? Like, how much is Twitch making off the eyeballs that watch the product on their platform? And will that affect how they can do broadcast rights deals? What would you say to that aspect as someone with knowledge of the industry but not directly involved with the broadcast aspect yourself?
I mean, I'd say two things, right? One is in a model in which both a tournament organizer and the broadcast platform are trying to sell brands similar inventory, that becomes difficult, right? So in the NFL, when the NFL licenses its rights to a major cable network, that cable network assumes the sales rights for a lot of the pieces of that inventory. And the NFL is okay with that because the combination of the license fee, but also the ticketing, the merchandising, and all the other kind of direct monetization of the fans adds up to something where they're okay giving up some of those rights. The difference in esports is that when Immortals is broadcasting on Twitch, or when ESL is broadcasting on Facebook, and Facebook and Twitch want to go out and sell ads against that content, they're probably selling to brands, or in fact they are selling to brands, 30-second ad spots that are also brands that ESL and Immortals are trying to pitch on sponsorship, and are probably also brands that ESL is trying to pitch on kind of more media buy-esque type deals. And that leads to a lot of channel conflict, so that's an issue. But what I would point out is, what I was advocating when Ryan was still on the call around more direct monetization of fans versus like this business to business monetization from ads and sponsors. If you think about an individual influencer like, let's say, Ninja, right? I'm going to keep using Ninja as an example just because he's kind of universal at this point. He has 230,000 odd subscribers on Twitch. Let's just assume he gets half of every single subscription and that revenue, right? So he's making $2.50 for every single subscriber. That means if those numbers are consistent, he's making over $500,000 a month. That isn't a license fee. It's not coming out of Twitch's pocket. It's not funded by an advertiser. It's funded by the people that love his content.
Yeah.
And for those people, if he were to leave Twitch, he doesn't keep those subscribers inherently. And so his fans and their enjoyment of his content, but specifically their enjoyment of his content on the Twitch platform, they are incentivizing him to stay on that platform without a licensing fee coming into the equation.
Yes.
The difficulty is that when you look at a tournament organizer or you look at a team where there aren't those functionalities that let you monetize your fans on a particular platform, that stickiness isn't there as much, right? If ESL had 1 million subscribers on Twitch that were paying them $2.50 a month each, and that Twitch didn't have to pay out of their own pocket, independent of what the licensing fee from a different platform would be, that would be a massive incentive for ESL to stay on Facebook and to keep that revenue stream. And sure, you can overcome that, right? And of course, that's not a guarantee of anything. But I think the way that Twitch works with individual influencers is a model for how Twitch and other platforms can work for their kind of tentpole content, like team content or like tournament organizer content, where instead of paying a bunch of money out of pocket and having to justify it based on ad sales, they're instead giving teams and tournament organizers the tools that they need to monetize their own audience, and therefore incentivizing you to stick with the audience you already have on the platform you already put your content on. And that's the piece that's missing, right? Like right now, there's not a lot of stickiness and not a lot of, there's not a lot like tying a tournament organizer's content or tying team content to a particular platform, which is why it moves around from platform to platform so often.
Are we far away from that sort of thing, Ulrich?
I mean, I think we have some models that are interesting and where we're trying out other things, right? I mean, there's an opportunity, and I'm not saying it's going to become the norm, but for the regular content. But for example, what Snipe is doing for added content, which is exactly what Noah is saying, right? There are certain things that fans that want to pay more. So then maybe there's a free stream, which is what's currently being provided, and nothing is being taken away from anyone there, but then there is an additional stream which has 10 POVs, additional content and interesting pieces for those who are more engaged, and that is then where people can really get involved if they want to spend more money. Then I think
some of it comes to ESL, presumably if it's an ESL event, right?
Exactly. So that's interesting, and it also doesn't remove any of the existing enjoyment. And I know I think esports is facing the same dilemma as any other business that's moving from, say, and esports isn't moving, but is pretty much in the publishing dilemma that everybody else is in, where online content is really tough to get anyone to pay for because it's all available for free, and paywalls are difficult because then people leave your platforms. That type of thing is difficult.
Can I pop in there just for 1 second? Not to interrupt you, but that is something that people say a lot. And what I just want to jump in there with is it is absolutely difficult to stick non-differentiated content behind a paywall. If you are taking content that is cookie cutter and that it's available in other places for free and trying to get people to pay for it, that absolutely doesn't work. But if you can offer content that's differentiated and improved in quality for the viewer and adds value to a fan experience, then I think historically, both in esports and in gaming, we do see people pay for that content. That's what built platforms like Faceit and ESEA and Boomio. That's what built platforms like Netflix and HBO, right? If Netflix was just taking the same thing that you could get for free on Twitch and sticking it behind a subscription paywall, not a lot of people would pay for that. And sorry to interrupt, it's just that is a trigger phrase for me when people talk about the difficulties of monetizing digital content.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and I think there's a lot of potential in saying that there's a base product that is free, that everyone can use, that gets put on the regular platforms, but then there's an additional product that is much more engaged, much more interesting, and I think For example, Formula One, you can watch it on, on free TV in Germany, for example, but you can also watch it on Sky, and there's multiple camera angles. And I think that's, from what I read, it's, an interesting piece that pulls people in. Most of them don't use multiple camera angles, but just to have the opportunity to do it. So that is, I think, an interesting model, because it pretty much follows what many mobile games are doing, where for the vast majority of people, there's a free experience. It might have some things that don't work as easily, or you can bypass certain things if you pay, but you don't necessarily have to. So as long as you find a balance that doesn't, piss off the existing fan base, but still gives those who are more engaged an opportunity to directly contribute, then that's a good model, and it's probably not too far away. As we can see with Snipe, it already exists in some form.
Do you think it's the case, to touch on what you said before about how obviously in games where the league itself is part of the developer, like for a start off, they don't have to even break even or make money off it, in as much as they're making money from the game and it's all part of their marketing for the game? Is there a model, is anyone even pursuing this, where, for example, a developer that doesn't directly get involved as much, like Valve, would somehow partner with leagues to produce something game related, which then they get like a kickback, and then some of it comes to leagues? So for example, in CSGO, one of the reasons it's always been obvious as to why the majors get way more viewership is because, yes, there are people on there waiting to get a drop and hoping they get a Dragon Lore skin when it's Cobblestone or whatever, like that really has been a factor, because it can be the exact same teams a month earlier in another tournament that might look just as good to me on stream, but the viewership won't be there. So is there a world in which, is that model viable? Or do you think if the game developer wants to be involved, he'll just kind of think, why don't I just take all that? Why don't I do it myself, basically? How do you see that side of it?
No, I think it's an interesting model, and something, for example, that's worked well for Rainbow Six, where certainly they've driven audience to the streams through what they did with drops and items in the game. Okay. And I think as long as that there's a way for the publisher to find something that is, creates more engagement with the game, which is what they're looking for. And drops definitely do that. And then that engagement, or say the opportunity to get drops, also leads to more people watching the stream. I mean, it's a win-win essentially. So I think it's a perfect opportunity. And we've seen, especially with Valve, they've tried out different ways. Obviously for the majors, they give sticker revenue to the organizer. Yes. They don't. That's one thing, or the players as well. So that's a good way to let them participate. For Dota, they had this model in the past where you had this Dota TV ticket and participated in the revenue, yes, and there was an item attached to it. So there are multiple models for that, and unfortunately, it's been, it's not been developed further, especially on the Dota 2 side. But getting that connection where you say, people engage with the game, but at the same time, they engage in a forum that drives more audience to the streams, which then the tournament organizers can monetize. That's actually a great scenario. I think there's a lot of proof of concept there in various games. So that's definitely interesting, because not every time a publisher will want to run their own league, and obviously not viable because it's not core business to them. So as long as they can create something that enables this ecosystem to then, be much more integrated into the game experience, rather than just taking, here's the game and then monetization is my task and not the publisher, then I think it can help long-term create a more sustainable ecosystem for that game. Okay.
Right, as we kind of start to close up now, Noah, I thought a good question to ask you, because the subtext of a lot of what you said is that you're very interested in the idea of people trying to specifically cater to, for example, in your case, obviously it would be like a fan of Immortals or something who's watching the league, but generally to cater to the hardcore fans more, give them something different in that sense, find a way whereby they can directly contribute to the people hosting a stream, tournament organizer, whoever that might be, and this kind of a model. Do you see this as something where, is there an impediment at the moment? For example, every time Ryan Fwiz answered, he basically just went back to sort of saying oh yeah, we've sort of thought about that before, but the scale isn't there yet, or it just doesn't financially make sense yet, or it's a ways off, or, he sort of had some reason it almost seemed like a mentality thing. So is this a thing that either gradually works its way up and either esports gets bigger and they eventually do it like he suggested, where, eventually the sheer scale would mean that they'd put people onto developing tech specifically for that? Or is it more like one of these broadcast platforms will do something like this and then that'll be like the paradigm breaker and they'll just have fabulous success and that'll force everyone to start? How do you kind of see it unfolding in the next few years?
I think in some ways Fwiz is right, and in some ways I disagree, right? I think he's right in that, like, right now it probably doesn't make a ton of sense for a platform like YouTube to commit development resources to building Immortals specific functionality, right? Like, I just don't think our fan base is at a big enough scale to justify that. But I do think that there are properties in esports where it does make sense. If you look at a long-term deal between Twitch and Overwatch League, or a long-term deal between BAM Tech and Riot Games around LCS, I think as you target those tentpole properties that are at the very top of esports that have the biggest scale, and you make it long-term so that there's time to build that tech and time to really monetize with the tech once it's already built, then you have enough of an incentive to divert product and development resources towards figuring out that piece of what the platform needs to be. I think ESL might be at that scale, right? I think there might be a future in which ESL signs a long-term, like a very long-term deal with one platform, not just because they're offering a good license fee, but because they're offering development resources to really build out what an ideal platform for ESL would look like. I mean, hell, theoretically, if you're at the scale of ESL, you could try to strike a deal with a platform serving as a white label and create an ESL-branded platform in which everything else kind of lived. But, that's just me spitballing a little bit. From my perspective, that's what the first step on the path of success looks like. You take the very biggest publishers, the very biggest leagues, the biggest content creators, and you experiment with them, you build out the functionality with them, and then you make that functionality available for the mid-tier creators or the mid-tier organizers or the mid-tier of teams that might not generate a sufficient scale of content to build out the functionality for them in the first place, but they still get to benefit off of the trickle-down effect once that functionality has been built for guys like Blizzard and Overwatch League, or once that functionality has been built for ESL.
Okay. Right, you need to hop off now, mate?
Yeah, with that I am off. Thank you again, this was great.
Yeah. Right, I thought as a last topic to talk about, there's only two of us left at this point. Okay, so as a final thing to address, a lot of what we've actually ended up addressing were things like specifically to esports right now, the things that are sort of hurdles that have to be gotten over, or actually areas. Some of them I actually found a bit depressing because I hadn't kind of connected some of the dots that actually, this often happens when I have to explain esports to people outside of esports. I sometimes have to explain to them things like, for example, when people say, why isn't there more esports journalism? I say, well, there's actually less journalism in general on the internet because people haven't figured out how to monetize it. So good news is it's not esports specific. Bad news is we're in the same boat as them. And if it's sinking, then it's sinking. So along those lines, there was a lot of areas I found where basically no one had an answer. And we've had to just speculate what could happen and where it could change, etc. For people, obviously, who are going to watch this, and they are very specifically thinking of things like the deals that have been done in Counter-Strike, or if they're thinking to themselves, does this mean in a year from now, a big tournament I watch, for example, with ESL will be on a different broadcasting platform? What do you think the trickiest thing is at the moment to navigate about that? Because on the one hand, with the old model, you should just stay with whichever platform. So let's imagine it's Twitch at the moment, has the most raw eyeballs on it, and that gets the most numbers. You take the number to the sponsor, you say, look, I've got X million, bajillion, what will he give me in exchange for that? But isn't kind of the issue that if you stay back there, first of all, some other league, some other organizer might get further down the path here, and maybe some of these hurdles get out of the way and they succeed and they're beating you directly. But then there's also the factor that you can't really transition the business model itself, because in some ways, we didn't really address this before, but hasn't kind of the model of just get the most raw eyeballs onto an online, say, Twitch stream, that to some degree feels like it's a bit capped out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's if you look at the different products that we have, then there isn't just one strategy where we say, okay, this is now all on Facebook or this is now all on Twitch. But we have English language for Pro League for the next until the end of 2019 on Facebook. ESL1 is on Facebook for 2018 for now. and IEM is just non-exclusive basically on any bigger platform. And then we have platforms like Mixer coming into play, which also have a lot of our content now. So I think the biggest challenge to navigate at this point is that the platforms are looking for the next big title, right? I mean, there's not, I think, a lot of confidence in CSGO doubling its numbers because the numbers are already so big. So it's really tough for them to grow bigger. So they bank on Overwatch League being the next big thing or Fortnite being the next big thing. So that's difficult to navigate. At the same time, CSGO is a really mature ecosystem, but lots of players also in the ecosystem, lots of tournament organizers. And because players also earn high salaries and the expectations are high, it's very expensive to produce these tournaments. At the moment, that content is great, and CSGO is one of the biggest titles in esports. But at the same time, with platforms, especially with the ones that have been in esports for a while, they're rather looking to diversify and find a different audience, right? Because for Twitch, they probably have a big portion of the existing CSGO audience there. All of the majors were there, so I'd be really surprised if someone plays CSGO has never heard of Twitch. Whereas for a platform like Facebook, it's really interesting to get that audience and tell them, look, streaming and esports is now on Facebook, or for YouTube equally. So for any platform, there are basically different incentives that they have and different ideas that they have. So Twitch wants to diversify and other platforms want to build up that whole habit of watching streams on them, and navigating that in the context of everything being really competitive and everybody wanting to be the first. I think that's the biggest challenge. And obviously it shouldn't be done in a way that, it affects the consumer, but in various other areas, also with tournaments overlapping, you can see that, it's really competitive. So that's why essentially all of the audience at the moment is part of a big experiment where all platforms are trying to figure out what the best way is going forward, and where there isn't a clear, this is the number one esports title, this is how it works, this is the league, and probably never will be, but that's why there is some experimentation also with what kind of event size is correct, what kind of pricing is correct for event tickets, and that's probably something that's going to go on for a while, even though things have stabilized a bit. So that certain products are going to just keep coming back every year. But at the same time, new titles are coming in. Nobody really knows what to do with Battle Royale and what the right model is. So that there's always going to be some kind of experimentation. And I think especially on the platform side, the times of everything just being on Twitch, they're probably over just because the other platforms see it as something that they can't miss out on and where they need to get their foot in the door. And I know that at the moment we're getting a lot of flack for moving to different platforms, but ECS is on YouTube, and I think there will be other deals where Twitch might not be the platform that certain tournament organizers broadcast on.
This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, Gman, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing, but I've graduated from that mindset, and now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.